Why is this couple smiling? Perhaps they found hope, meaning, and purpose in the book of Revelation. Nearly 2,000 years ago, a lonely man on a distant island received a remarkable vision. Some readers have been frightened by his vision, but many more have found in it the hope, meaning, and purpose they were looking for. And now, here are your hosts, Dr. Jon Paulien and Dr. Graeme Bradford.
Hi, I'm Jon.
And I'm Graeme.
And welcome to Revelation, Hope, Meaning, Purpose. We've been talking about Revelation 11.
That's right. It's a very difficult chapter in many respects, and yet some things come through very clear. The sweetness of hearing about Jesus, the joy that comes to your heart, but sometimes when you share it, you get some opposition which can be bitter. And it talks here about the gospel going to the world at the end of time and the sweetness of sharing it, which could sometimes be bitter. All right, so the final proclamation, and we saw that chapter 11 in some respects is like an introduction in many areas to the rest of the book. Yeah.
Well, chapter 11 does come as part of the seven trumpets of Revelation. And the seven trumpets begin with the intercession of Jesus, the incense going up, and this occurred at the time he ascended to heaven in the first century. And the trumpets continue as a sequence of events through history of God's judgments on those who have harmed his people. And it comes right up to the seventh trumpet, which is the very last moment before the end of time. At this point, we are moving into the seventh trumpet itself, and this not only portrays the final events of Earth's history, but it has implications for the rest of the book of Revelation, as we will see. Let's go to the text, and that text is Revelation 11 and verses 15 through 19. Graeme, why don't you read that for us?
Sure. The seventh angel sounded his trumpet, and there were heard loud voices in heaven, which said, "The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever." And the 24 elders who were seated on their thrones before God fell on their faces and worshipped God. "We give thanks to you, Lord God Almighty, the one who is and who was, because you have taken your great power and have begun to reign. The nations were angry, and your wrath has come. The time has come for judging the dead, and for rewarding your servants, the prophets, and your saints, and those who reverence your name, both small and great, and for destroying those who destroy the earth." Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and within his temple was seen the ark of his covenant. And there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and a great hailstorm.
I'd like to, if we could put that back on the screen, chapter 11, 19. There's a couple of things I'd like to point out there. First of all, it mentions the temple again. And at the beginning of the chapter, there's a mention of the heavenly temple. So this comes to completion. The end of the chapter mentions the temple. The beginning mentions it. One other thing, it talks about the ark of his covenant. So this theme of covenant, I think, is something we've mentioned from time to time, but we want to get a little bit closer to that, understand just a little bit better what that covenant is all about. What we have here, we're at the very center of the book, geographically, from the very first verse to the very last. You come right to the middle, chapter 11, verses 15 to 19. As the seventh trumpet, it's the climax of the seven trumpet sequences, but also we have here a bit of a foretaste of what is yet to come, and we'll come back to that at a later point in time. So let's move ahead. Since we're back to the temple, we need to learn a little bit more about the temple here. There's a slide I'd like you to see, which is a beautiful picture of what the temple was like, the ancient sanctuary when the Israelites were in the wilderness before Mount Sinai. The pillar of fire was over that temple, and we've drawn a couple of maps for you so you can get an idea a bit more of the relationship among the various parts of that sanctuary in the wilderness. Here you see in the upper part of the map, there's a large enclosure which has curtains all the way around it. So it's outdoors still inside the big rectangle, but inside that rectangle is another rectangle, which is the actual sanctuary itself. There are a couple of items in the outer court. You have a laver, which is a water basin, and then an altar of burnt offering or sacrifice. Coming down to the lower illustration, the Ark of the Covenant, which is mentioned in chapter 11, verse 19, is in the most holy place to the left. And as you can see, there's a perfect square looking down on it. It's the same width and the same length. And then there's another chamber to the right of that. That is the holy place, and that contains three things: the candlestick or lampstand, which we've seen in Revelation. There's a table of showbread or some special sanctuary bread, and the altar of incense, which we saw at the beginning of the trumpets. This gives you a bit more of an idea of the geography inside the sanctuary. These various aspects of the sanctuary form an introduction to each of the visions of the book of Revelation. We could look at another slide, and in that slide it shows us that there are 7 visions in Revelation. You have that chiastic look, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then back down to 7. And the first of these is introduced by a vision that's on earth, Jesus among the candlesticks there on Patmos. The last vision also occurs on earth when the New Jerusalem comes down. In the middle, there are 5 scenes: Revelation 4 and 5, Revelation 8, Revelation 11, which we are in now, and so forth. And what we see here is we've come to the climax sanctuary scene of the book. A view of the most holy place, a view of the Ark of the Covenant. If you were to go to Greek temples in Egypt, the guides would take you inside. When you get to that little chamber at the center, they say, this is the naos, the most holy place of the temple. That's the place where in the Older Testament God himself
So you're
was
saying,
living.
John, that if we allow and have an understanding of the sanctuary services in the Old Testament, they will help to guide us through Revelation,
Exactly.
giving us clues as to what is happening. Our understanding of this service really is a very important part of understanding Revelation.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think that many Christian people, many followers of Jesus feel as if the sanctuary stuff, the sacrifice stuff, that's ancient, it's unimportant, it's uninteresting. But that's not the way the Bible handles it. The Bible, the Older Testament, is full of sanctuary images all the way through. In the New Testament, you have 2 books in particular, the Epistle to the Hebrews and also the book of Revelation, that are just riddled with sanctuary images.
That's very important for Christians,
Yeah.
isn't it? Because Hebrews is really saying this is what it means for Christians. And, you know, some Christians are inclined to disregard it and say that's just Old Testament Jewish, but it is very important for Christians.
That's right.
Yeah.
And in the book of Revelation, if you don't know something about these things, we're trying to give our viewers a bit of an introduction. And if you don't know anything about it, you're going to have a hard time understanding this book. I believe there's one more photo that we have showing the sanctuary. And on the right, you see an inset into that photo. There you can see the lampstand, the table of showbread, the altar of incense with the priest standing before it. And behind, the curtain is made transparent there, so you can see the Ark of the Covenant behind in the most holy place. So we showed you an overhead view. Now this view a little bit more from behind. There's a couple guidepost texts in this passage, Graeme.
Okay, let's bring on our first one. And it talks here in Revelation chapter 11, verse 15, of a transition to God's eternal heaven, kingdom. The 7th angel sounded his trumpet, and there were heard loud voices in heaven, which said, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever. All right, that's exciting, isn't it?
Well, this is a real climax, isn't it?
Yeah, this is where God says, okay, that's it, isn't it?
In a real sense, Jesus takes the rulership over the earth back in chapter 5 when he takes the scroll. That's
Right.
when he becomes the king. But also here, there's a new stage. This is the seventh trumpet. We've come to the very final moment. It doesn't mention the second coming of Jesus, but that's certainly implied. At this moment in heaven, there's this tremendous rejoicing, realizing that God has now come to take over control of this earth. Today, Jesus does rule, but most people aren't aware of that. So this guidepost text helps us to realize that the climax of the trumpets has come to the very end of Earth's history.
Okay, very, very helpful. And our next guidepost text is Revelation chapter 11 and verse 18. And here it says, "The nations were angry and your wrath has come. The time has come for judging the dead and for rewarding your servants the prophets and your saints and those who reverence your name, both small and great, and for destroying those who destroy the earth." So there's a lot in this verse, John. A lot in this verse, isn't there? And we're going to come back later and look at it more in more detail, but it is another guidepost. Almost everything that's going to happen from now on in Revelation is found in that one verse. I mean, who could have written a book like this?
Yeah. You talk about nutshells in Australia, don't you?
Yeah. Don't you have nuts here?
Yeah, we do.
Okay.
They sometimes say California is the land of fruits and nuts.
Right, nutshell. Here it is in a concise, precise way, isn't it? And here it is, we'll unpack that more at our next session.
Yeah, in a real sense, 11:18 forecasts everything that happens in the second half of the book. Well, there's good news here in the seventh trumpet, and that good news is that while God may not seem in control of the events of this earth at this point in time, at this point in history, there is the promise that as Jesus said in his prayer, "Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven." That's the moment that we're coming to here in the seventh trumpet. It's that moment when God does take control, when he does begin to put a final end to evil in this world. When we come back, we'll go a little bit further into these texts. Welcome back. We mentioned last time that Revelation 11 verses 15 to 19 is the geographic center of the book of Revelation. That seems to be a good context in which to talk a little bit more about the structure of the book of Revelation. And I remember that this came to mind when I saw a model of the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, and I noticed the beautiful symmetrical structure of that ancient building. Of course, it's gone now in reality, but there are models still that people have. And that triggered a bit of a speech that I'd like you to hear, Graeme.
Sure.
I'm standing in the Museum of Ephesus, and we have here a model of the Temple of Artemis, a place that we have elsewhere seen to be the object of quarrying, and most of the rocks are gone. But in ancient times, it was an enormous and very magnificent building. What I want you to see is that there's tremendous symmetry of structure here. Everything is in balance. And the ancients had a great deal of love for symmetry of structure. When it comes to structuring a book, there is a concept called chiasm. And in the chiasm, the material at the beginning of the book matches up with the material at the end. And then the next section matches up with the second from the end, and so on, till you get to the middle. Now, there's two possible types of chiasm. One is an even-numbered chiasm. Let's say you have 6 segments, 3 on one side, 3 on the other side. That would be an even chiasm. The emphasis in such a book would be at the edges. But when you have an odd-numbered chiasm, such as Revelation, where you have 7 items, the emphasis comes on the middle item. That which is in the middle is the point of emphasis. That's why knowing that the book of Revelation is structured in that way can be tremendously helpful in understanding it. Now, for me, the exciting part is this. The center of the book of Revelation is chapters 12 through 14, where the final end-time war over the gospel takes place. But many scholars have noticed that there's a center of the center. And the center of the center is the three angels' messages of Revelation 14, verses 6 through 12. But I'd like to take it one step further. I believe that there's a center of the center of the center. And that would be Revelation 14:7, the very last line, which it calls people at the end of time to worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the fountains of waters. The word worship occurs 8 times in these couple of chapters, 13 and 14. 7 times it refers to the beast. It refers to the image of the beast, the enemies of God. Only once is there a call to worship God. That call is the very heart of the message of the book.
Well, John, that is interesting. So we're on focus as we're studying this book and talking about it. We should keep that hub in mind, shouldn't we? Mm-hmm. Revelation's a call to worship the Creator.
In this program, we've come to the place where that central part of the book begins. And it begins with chapter 11 and verse 19. So this seemed to be a good place to introduce the concept of this. Let's look a little bit at the evidence for this. If we could have the view of the structure back on the screen. You saw this during that clip. And you will notice you have in the book of Revelation 7 visions, the 7 churches, A, B, C, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, final crisis in the center, then the 7 bowls, millennium, New Jerusalem. There's a prologue and an epilogue, and these are just a few verses at the beginning and at the end. What I'd encourage you to do sometime is take the prologue, take the epilogue, compare the two. And you will discover that there's a whole number of phrases and ideas that are parallel between the prologue and the epilogue. We've already noted, if we go back to that view, we've already noted tremendous parallels between the 7 trumpets, C, and the 7 bowls, which are on the other side. We haven't said so much, but I think we've made note. The 7 churches actually have a number of promises. And the New Jerusalem part at the end of the book fulfills those promises. So you see there's connections in a stair-step leading up to a pyramid here in the structure. So that is the structure of the book of Revelation. I think one of the most important discoveries that I've ever made as a biblical scholar was to discover that 7-point structure of the main visions of the book. And the key to unlocking that structure is really the second half of the book. Because the first half of the book is relatively easy to structure. John himself has a series of 7 letters to the churches, and they're numbered, you see. And then you have a series of 7 seals that come along, then a series of 7 trumpets. It's not hard to structure that part of the book because so much of that work is done for you. When you get to the second half of the book, it's a lot harder to create that structure because you have fewer of those kinds of cues. And so that's why Revelation 11:18 became so important to me, and Graeme is going to unpack that for us in just a moment. 11:18 is the climax of the 7 trumpets, and yet it also has clues in it of how to structure the second half of the book. And having done that, I came to realize we have a pyramid here, a chiasm it is so called, that ends up in the center. And the center of the book is beginning with 11:19, chapters 12 to 14. The center of the center, as I mentioned, is the 3 angels' messages. And even in the middle of that, there's a particular saying that we will focus on in a later program that is the center of the center of the center. So John has structured this book in an amazing way. To me, it suggests perhaps a bit of God's hand in how this was structured, because human beings would have a difficult time probably creating something that intricate.
You'd have to see the hand of God there, wouldn't you? Making this come together and seeing these clues that you've alluded to helps us to going off on all different tangents and wild speculation. Keep with the basic structure of the book, and I think what you said is really excellent. So perhaps we could have 11:18 up, and we can look at what it says. The nations were angry, and your wrath has come. The time has come for judging the dead and for rewarding your servants, the prophets, and your saints, and those who reverence your name, both small and great, and for destroying those who destroy the earth. So essentially what you're saying here, John, is in this one verse, we have the points that come up to guide us through the second half of the book. Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right, that's fascinating. So let's have a look at these points and we'll work through them as we go through them one by one. The nations were angry. All right, John, Revelation 12:17.
So the things on the left side of this screen are terms, phrases that occur in 11:18. The things on the right are crucial passages, guidepost passages later on that pick up those very phrases. So the phrases of 11:18 are scattered throughout the second half of the book.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So Revelation 12:17, it talks here about how then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to make war against the rest of her offspring, those who obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. So, okay, this is the wrath of the dragon at the end of time, the conflict over worship and the law of God, and that would be the first part of our text.
So in a nutshell there, the author has talked about the central verse of 12, 13, and 14. Chapters 12 to 14 all are bouncing off what happens in 12:17, and we'll come to that in a later program and see how that works out.
Okay, let's have our diagram back again. Your wrath has come, and we've got listed up there Revelation 15 verse 1. And I saw in heaven another great and marvelous sign, 7 angels with the 7 last plagues. Last, because with them God's wrath is completed. So here we have a reference in this verse to the plagues where God's wrath is given in response to the crisis that is caused over worship. It's God's wrath. So that's neat.
So the 7 plagues occur in chapters 15 and 16. And then the big question structurally becomes, what do you do with chapters 17 and 18? And these both look back to chapter 16 as a foundation. The wrath of God, in other words, God's response to the angry nations is to put them in their place. And he does that in chapters 15, 16, 17, and 18. So there's a piece that parallels the 7 trumpets.
Okay, very good. Let's have our screen back again with the picture on it, and it says, time to judge the dead. And I notice we have Revelation 20 and verse 12. And it says here in Revelation 20 verse 12, and I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books. So here's a reference to 11:18 again, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's pointing forward to the 1,000 years of chapter 20.
Okay, that's good. All right, the next point we have on our screen again is time to reward. Okay, time for rewards. Revelation 22 and verses 11 and 12 talk here about rewards. It says here in Revelation 22 and verse 11, it says, all right, let him who does wrong continue to do wrong. Let him who is vile continue to be vile. Let him who does right continue to do right. And let him who is holy continue to be holy. Behold, I am coming soon. My reward is with me, and I will give to everyone according to what he has done. So here's your rewards.
Yeah, chapter 21 and 22.
Give the rewards.
The whole New Jerusalem is showing that reward.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay,
Bring in
and let's
detail.
have our screen back again. And it says, destroy those who destroy the earth. And here we have in Revelation chapter 19 and verses 1 and 2. After this I heard, and what sounded like a roar of a great multitude in heaven, shouting, Alleluia! Salvation and glory and power belong to our God, for true and just are his judgments. He has condemned the great prostitute who corrupted the earth by her adulteries. He has avenged on her the blood of his servants. So here we have.
And that sort of summarizes chapter 19. So each of the last 10 chapters of the book, from 12 all the way through 22, I guess that would be 11. Each of those chapters is referenced in principle in 11:18. So the structure of Revelation, I think, is something that's becoming a lot clearer to us.
And should stop us from zooming off and tangents and pet ideas. Yeah.
Now in Revelation 11:19, there were 2 main themes. One is the temple, the other is the covenant. And we've gotten the person who is perhaps the world's greatest living scholar on the issue of covenant. And he's going to give us a little piece to introduce us to what will come in our next segment.
Okay.
The Bible's discussion of the covenants centers on the Old and New Covenants. And many people understand the Old Covenant to be the covenant God made with his people at Mount Sinai, and the New Covenant to be the covenant he made with his people in the New Testament period of time. But a careful study of the Bible presentation on the covenant shows that the Old and New Covenants are different responses to the gospel. The Old Covenant's a faulty response, a legalistic, or rebellious, or faithless response, and the New Covenant is a faith response to the gospel and an obedience that comes from faith. God made this very clear when he presented the New Covenant in Jeremiah 31 and Hebrews chapter 8. He identifies the New Covenant as 4 gospel promises. I'm going to write my law in your heart. I'll be your God, you'll be my people. There'll be a day come when everyone will know me, and I will forgive your sins. Careful study of the Old Testament finds that every one of those 4 New Covenant promises are embedded in every covenant God ever made with his people. They're all the way through the Old Testament, those New Covenant promises. So the Old Testament is New Covenant as well as the New Testament period from God's perspective. But the responses of the people were different. And God said what he expected to be different about the New Covenant was a different response of the people, that they would respond in faith and the obedience of faith rather than a legalistic response. Paul keyed off of that. And when he talks about Old Covenant and New Covenant, he's focusing on the response of the people. These are spiritual heart matters that he's talking about, and not chronological historical eras and different covenants God made with people. I wrote a book on this subject called In Granite and in Grain, published by the Andrews University Press, that shows how these covenants are embedded, the promises of the New Covenant are embedded in all of God's promises, and how it's faulty response that's being referred to. In Galatians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul says that if an old covenant person is a person who's born of the flesh and not of the Spirit and will not even inherit the kingdom of God. So by God's grace, I want to be a new covenant believer. Every saved person in every historical era has been a new covenant believer. I want to be part of that group, and I pray that everyone will also be a new covenant believer and be saved and be with Christ eternally.
Quite a mouthful there. I think we need to come back to this issue of covenant, and we'll do that right after the break. Welcome back. We've introduced the idea of covenant, and as you can see, there's a lot in there, maybe a bit difficult to grasp at first. Graeme, take us a little deeper.
Sure. Jeremiah chapter 31 and verses 31 to 33 deal with the covenants as they appeared in Old Testament times with God's people. And in Jeremiah chapter 31 it says, "The time is coming, declares the Lord, when I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I'll make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I'll put my law in their minds and write it in their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people." And John, this is like Skip said, God's always wanted his law in the mind and the heart of his people. And God makes a new covenant with Israel in Old Testament times. Not just New Testament times. God has always been offering his new covenant, you might say, the everlasting covenant, which is really salvation through Christ. I don't believe we're going to have a divided heaven one day when people who lived before the cross say, well, you know, I lived under the old covenant and I worked hard and I'm a good guy and kept the law, that's why I'm here. And after the cross, somebody has to hang their head and say, well, I was nothing, all I had was Christ, I just had to trust in his righteousness. There'll be no divided heaven. As far as God's concerned, there's only one covenant, the everlasting covenant which he has offered to the human race since our first parents sinned. And as Skip has said so well, the problem was a faulty response from Israel. And you and I can make a faulty response too. And every time you say, okay, I'm going to do it myself, you're a legalist. You can't do it apart apart from accepting the righteousness of Jesus as a free gift, then God works in you to bring you into harmony with His law. He writes it on your mind and on your heart. So that's been true for the whole human race all the way through. So the idea of covenant is very important for Revelation. And our next text here in Exodus is Exodus chapter 34, is going to show something very important for Revelation. It says, Moses was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights without eating bread or drinking water. He wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the Testament in his hands, he was not aware that his face was radiant because he had spoken with God. Now, the important thing for us here is that the 10 Commandments are also called the testimony and the covenant. And this is important because John in the book of Revelation never mentions the word law or 10 Commandments, but he does use the word Ark of the Covenant, Tabernacle of the Testimony, and he calls for a worship of the commandments of God, which according to the context we're going to see really are the 10 Commandments. So that's a very, very important thing for us.
So everything in this passage, Exodus 35, all those items there are found in the book of Revelation,
Yes,
you're saying?
Yes. And a person who is familiar with the Old Testament would recognize these terms when they see them in Revelation. In other words, we'll keep working through this and we'll see it comes even clearer. So let's have our images come through, and we see 3 ways of describing the law of God in the Old Testament. Words of the covenant, 10 Commandments of God, the tables of testimony. And these are the concept of testimony and covenant are certainly Ark of the Covenant, Tabernacle of the Testimony are certainly terms in Revelation, which is another way of saying Ark of the 10 Commandments or Tabernacle of the Testimony, which is the 10 Commandments. These are terms that John uses, particularly when he's describing the end of time. So the sanctuary was a very important part of all that was happening. Revelation chapter 11 and verse 19 is the text we're focusing on. And when it says God's temple in heaven was opened, and within his temple was seen the Ark of his covenant, it really is another way of saying Ark of the 10 Commandments. For coming up is a contest over worship and the law of God as a response to the gospel. This is not legalism. This is how you respond when you worship the Creator. So all these images of the sanctuary out there in the desert, all the images of the sanctuary around Sinai, which we have coming through on our screen, these here are very important because what John is seeing in vision now is right into the most holy place of the sanctuary. We learn about this from the type on earth. And we see John now is seeing this scene, as it were, in the heaven, the Ark of the Covenant, and inside the Ark was the 10 Commandments. And our images coming up now, which will come up fairly soon, will show that inside that ark was the 10 Commandments. So, Revelation chapter 15 and verse 5, we have like here in this approach to your chiasm, as we enter, we have Revelation 11:19, the Ark of the Covenant, but as we come out the other side, we have this text here called Revelation 15 and verse 5, and as after this I looked in heaven, and the temple, that is the tabernacle of the testimony, was open. It's almost, John, as if God has pointed this direction. As we go in, the Ark of the Covenant, as we come out, he points back, the tabernacle of the testimony. Because right in the center, the 10 Commandments.
That is fascinating. So when we come to this chiasm, the very central part is chapters 12 through 14. And you're saying, at the introduction to that central core part of the book, this is where the key message of the book is. At that introduction, you have a view of the 10 Commandments at the beginning and one at the end.
Yeah, and God says, don't miss this. It's like as if he's built this in such a way that don't miss it.
So somehow the commandments of God, in the context of the gospel, is going to be the underlying message of chapters 12 to 14.
Sure, as a response to the gospel. This is not legalism. This is the love relationship of who, how, and when you worship is all part of a package.
Where was the gospel in Mount Sinai?
Where is the gospel to Mount Sinai? God really wanted to write that law in their hearts, and they were shown in the sanctuary system how they could receive forgiveness through the offering of the lamb and the sacrifice, and they were to respond with gratitude just like you and I would respond. The book of Hebrews says, unto them was the gospel preached as well as unto us.
I would
They
take
had
it even a step further. I think they were already saved when they got to Sinai because they had been prisoners in Egypt. They were slaves there, and God brought them out with incredible miracles.
Right.
And this was a great, mighty action of salvation on God's part. And now when he comes to Mount Sinai, he says, we've got a relationship going here. How's that relationship going to work?
Right.
And that's where covenant and law comes in.
Okay, very good. The tabernacle in the wilderness, of course, was where God was teaching people of how they could receive that forgiveness. And your point is true. I'm the Lord your God, and then he gives the 10 Commandments, I have redeemed you.
Yeah.
To redeem people. Very good point. Very good point. And Revelation 12:17 talks now, as we are again heading towards that chiasm, another survey of what is coming up. And notice the point, the dragon says the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to make war against the rest of her offspring, those who obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. So here again, we're given so much evidence as we're going to that center, the commandments of God are going to be part of this end time issue over worship. And we come out and we find the other side, God's response in Revelation 14:12. This calls for patient endurance on the part of the saints who obey God's commandments and remain faithful to Jesus. So both sides, we've got help, haven't we? To get this right in the center of Revelation. The commandments of God, the idea of worship and who and how you worship. But this ark is very significant here, John, this ark. And here is a model of this ark. And inside this ark, this would be in John's mind, inside the ark, we do find the 10 Commandments inside that ark. And it was written there. And so a person who knew the Scripture, as these people to whom it was written, and John himself, would be thinking, inside here we have the 10 Commandments. And so the 10 Commandments, the tables of stone, and as we're going to see, people don't usually get into trouble with the last 6 as far as the end time worship is concerned. The issue coming up is worship. So the first 4 we're going to find are very much in focus here.
Well, this is fascinating, Graeme. You've covered a lot of ground, but I think there's a really crucial element here. There's 2 things. First of all, the concept Old Testament may be a little misleading. It sounds like Old Covenant, that's back then.
Yeah.
We're no longer interested in that. But you're saying that even the Sinai Covenant was grace.
Oh,
He had
yes.
already brought them out. He's offering them through the sanctuary service, a continuing relationship.
And when they went astray, he
Yeah.
offers it to them again.
Yeah.
In that sense, it's a new covenant.
Yeah.
But it's the same one because, as Skip so well said, they were making faulty responses.
Yeah.
But a very simple way of putting it, I think, John, is God doesn't reserve the new covenant for New Testament times after the cross. When Hebrews chapter 8 is talking about a new covenant, it's taking it straight out of Jeremiah chapter 31.
Yeah.
And he makes it with Israel and the house of Judah. And with them, he wanted to write the law in their mind and in their hearts. This is not just reserved for us today. God's always wanted that response.
So what we call the Old Testament should really be called the story of the Old and New Covenants in the history of Israel. Yeah.
Maybe, yeah.
The other point that I would make, that underlined from what you said, is showing how this central apex of the structure of Revelation is grounded in the idea of covenant, grounded in the idea of the 10 Commandments. And as we go through this, we want to give careful attention to those themes.
Absolutely.
So thank you again. We're going to take a little break, and when we come back, we will continue with these matters. Welcome back. We're talking about the concept of covenant, and we've also mentioned the 10 Commandments, and I'd like to bring you to something very, very interesting. We've talked about how the commandments are a substructure of chapters 12 to 14 of the book of Revelation. I'd like to take you to chapter 13 just for a moment here, because in chapter 13 you have a beast that comes up out of the sea, and that beast counterfeits the commandments of God. The first commandment is to worship God and God alone, yet in chapter 13 there's a command to worship the beast. The second commandment is not to worship images, but there's a command in chapter 13 to worship his image. Third commandment is about not taking God's name in vain, but this beast rejoices in blaspheming God. And then finally, it talks about receiving the mark of the beast. And as we get closer to that, this connects with the Sabbath commandment of the 10. So the commandments are a major substructure of chapters 12 to 14, as we saw in our last session. But in chapter 13, the particular focus seems to be on worship. And in particular, there's a focus on the Sabbath command. In the final crisis of Earth's history, evidently, the commandments of God, particularly the first set of commandments, these first four, are of special significance. When it comes to the Sabbath, a lot of people perhaps who know the Old Testament wonder, is the Sabbath something universal, or is it something that was given only to the Jews? And there's a scholar, Richard Davidson, who reflects on that just a little bit.
Well, some people believe that the seventh-day Sabbath was part of the ceremonial law, which was done away with by the death of Christ, or that it was only applicable for the Jewish people. But I find that the Bible teaches otherwise. According to Exodus 20, the Sabbath was part of the universal moral law, the Ten Commandments. And the reason given in the fourth commandment there in Exodus 20, the reason given for the keeping of the Sabbath was that it was a memorial pointing back to creation. And when we go back to the beginning of the Bible, there in Genesis chapter 2, we find that God himself instituted the seventh-day Sabbath. And he rested, he blessed it, and he made it holy. And this was even before there was a ceremonial law and before there was a Jewish people. In the New Testament, Jesus points back to this creation origin of the Sabbath. In Mark 2:27, he points out that it was intended for all humanity. I quote, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. And the word for man here is anthropos, which refers to all humankind, not just to the Jewish people. I find that the Bible makes very clear the distinction between the permanent weekly Sabbath and the annual ceremonial Sabbaths. The weekly Sabbath was, as we've already said, a memorial pointing backward to creation, while the ceremonial Sabbaths came after sin as a type or shadow pointing forward to the plan of salvation. So, for example, in Leviticus 23, we have a clear distinction between the weekly Sabbath, which is called the Sabbath of the Lord, and the ceremonial Sabbaths, which were linked to the sacrificial system.
Okay, interesting, isn't it? People often read in the Bible the word Sabbath and they seem to get these little things all mixed up. There's a mixture. They don't realize there were other Sabbaths beside the seventh-day Sabbath. And Dick, I think, has pointed it out pretty well. And we're going to look on the screen now what some of these Sabbaths were. And they were actually, you can see here, the spring festivals, the Passover, Feast of First Fruits, and Pentecost. And basically they were dealing with the first coming of Jesus, his death, resurrection, and also for Pentecost. So then we have the autumn festivals, Trumpets, Day of Atonement, Tabernacles, dealing with the second coming, and that's why we find so much of Revelation dealing with this type of imagery. But as Dick has so well said, these were shadows, as you were, to teach you about the ministry of Christ. But the seventh-day Sabbath goes back to creation, and it was not there to teach you about salvation, because back there it was first made, in Genesis, there was no need for salvation. There was no sin. And so while one group points forward, and we're temporary because Christ had yet to come and die, then we have the other group really point back to creation. So I think that's an important distinction,
So the seventh-day Sabbath is part of the Ten Commandments.
Makes it very big difference.
Which are universal, which are given to all peoples.
And right in the heart of the law, too.
And on the left side here of these two tables that you can see on the screen are 4 commands that relate to how we worship God. On the right side are 6 commands: honor thy father and mother, thou shalt not kill, etc., thou shalt not steal. These are commandments about how we relate to each other. And the interesting thing is most governments in the world are governed on the sense of these second 6 commandments, that society needs to hold together in the way we treat our parents and our children, that stealing and killing and telling false things all will tend to break society down. Most people don't have a huge problem recognizing the validity of commandments 5 through 10. It's the first 4 that focus particularly on our relationship with God. These are the ones that become the issue. And in the final crisis of Earth's history, according to Revelation 12 through 14, the commandments, particularly these first 4 commandments about worshiping God, including the Sabbath, these become at the core of the issue that they are facing there. But as Dr. Davidson mentioned, the commandments, particularly the Sabbath command, goes all the way back to creation. But that's not the only thing that goes back to creation, is it?
No, there are some other very important things that go back to creation. There's definitely a link up here with our next slide we're going to see with Calvary and creation too. Because, you know, in the beginning, God made man in his own image, planted him in the garden, and then he finished creation on the 6th day, had a Sabbath day rest, and that Sabbath day rest was the first time he spent a full day with mankind. And notice the pattern between Calvary and this too. And this is also, let's bring our image up, because this pattern is repeated at Calvary again, where we find that Jesus, he comes in our, as it were, becomes one of us. He's crucified in the garden. On the 6th day of the week when he dies, he cries out, "It is finished," and he has a Sabbath day rest in the tomb, and he rises on the Sunday morning. So there's definitely a link up here with Calvary and creation. And let me say this too, John, that we're not talking about some legalistic have-to commandment with the Sabbath. If you love God with all your heart and soul and mind, this is an expression of your faith in Him. It's not legalism. If you sort of feel, I have to keep these commandments, something's wrong with your experience, isn't it? It should grow out of a love relationship you have with Jesus.
So the thing that really counts here is, why would we give attention to the commandments? The book of Revelation clearly does. But why would we do that? In the context of a relationship with Jesus? And the answer is that obedience flows from a relationship that's already there. Because of what Jesus has done, we are already in relationship with God. We are accepted in Him. And out of that joy, out of that relationship, we freely respond to the things that God has done for us.
Sure.
That's why obedience is not legalism unless it's designed to get you to God.
And some people will say, why the 7th day? Why not any day? Well, really, God Himself has marked this off. And it's a symbol of loyalty, isn't it? Symbols can be very important. Your American flag is very important to you. Our Australian flag is very important to us. Soldiers die in battle over this symbol, don't they? This stands for the honor of a nation. So here God says, the 7th day is the Sabbath, I put it aside, I want you to meet with me and worship. And if people say, well, who cares? It's pretty serious, isn't it? It's a love relationship. It comes out of a right relationship we have with our Creator. All right.
In a moment we'll come back and we'll join Pamela and explore the idea. Are there any practical implications of this idea of covenant? Welcome back. Is the concept of covenant of any use in today's world? Let's find out. Pamela, does this concept of covenant mean anything to us?
Well, you sign a legal document when you get married.
Oh, marriage. Okay.
Sounds legalistic, doesn't it?
So that's a document. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So what does that do for you?
Well, I'm glad that you signed a legal document, because it's nice to know that you'll be there at the end of the day.
What, because he signed a document?
Yeah. How does a piece of paper bring me home at the end of the day?
Well, I just know that at the end of the day that you're going to be at my house and not someone else's house.
And the paper did that?
Yeah, it just gives me a feeling of security.
I think you're right. Now, some people would say it's only a piece of paper. It can be, can't it? It can be just a piece of paper. But when we make that covenant from our hearts, when we bind ourselves together. It provides security.
Yeah.
You know, there's an opportunity there that we say, okay, I know that she'll be there. I know that I'll be there. We set that. And what would be a reason to do that? I think it's because emotions are like this.
Yeah.
They're up and down. Have you ever felt like being anywhere but with me?
Well, emotions are emotions.
I took a bit of a risk there.
She's very honest.
I can guarantee you there were many moments when Pamela said, this guy, if I could only be somewhere else. But you know, I'm glad that you stuck with it. I'm glad that I stuck with it. And as we've confirmed this covenant together, we've had our rough moments, but it was worth it.
Yeah.
It's been 35 years, more than 35 years. And because of that covenant, there's security. I think that's the key to covenant. There's security in knowing that this relationship is going to continue.
Yeah.
And for the children,
Yeah.
that's extremely important.
Yeah.
You experienced several divorces from among your parents, and those have been something to struggle with ever since in terms of security, isn't it? So by providing a covenant, God provides for us security. He's not going to walk away from us. You know, we often feel like, I don't know if God's listening to me. He says, no. He says, I put it in writing.
And He's a God who keeps His word.
Yeah.
And I think that when you signed your marriage covenant, you weren't conscious, I have to sign.
Yeah.
You know, you were so in love that you said, this is the most natural thing to do, isn't it? And this is how Christianity is meant to be. You love God with all your heart and soul and mind, and you're not thinking, oh, I have to. Religion that is like that is drudgery. It's like a form of legalism. God is like a lover who courts our love response to Him. We love Him with all our heart and soul and mind. We allow Him to write His law in our mind and in our hearts, because that's the only way we will ever be happy. And I want to challenge you, as those who are watching this telecast, to enter into that covenant relationship with God. God is seeking you. He wants to bring you into harmony with His law, to give you joy and happiness, security now, and security for the world to come. You know, it's been great meeting with you in this telecast at this time, and I'm so glad that you have been watching us. And we want to tell you a little bit about what is coming up in our next program. Our next program is going to deal with Revelation chapter 12. We're now in the eye, as it were, of the whole of the chiasm. We're going to see the story behind the story. There's a big picture behind what is happening in your life and my life every day of the week.
If you've enjoyed this presentation on the Book of Revelation and would like more information, visit www.revelationhope.com. You can purchase your own DVD set of this series or the booklets, which cover the content of each program.